She was 18 years old and standing on a porch that had been hers for her entire life, except now it wasn't. The front door of the Brookline house was locked from the inside. She knew because she had tried the handle twice quietly, the way you try something when you already know the answer, but need the confirmation to make the loss real. On the welcome mat which her mother had bought 3 years ago from a catalog, and which read, "Bless this home" in faded gold script, sat a navy blue suitcase. It was the same suitcase the family had taken to Cape Cod the summer Amara was 12. The last summer her grandmother was alive, the last summer. Anything in the Nosu household had felt like it was held together by something warmer than obligation. On top of the suitcase was a white envelope and a single sheet of paper folded in thirds. The handwriting on the paper belonged to her mother. Amara did not cry. She had done her crying sometime around 3 in the morning alone in her bedroom, face pressed into the pillow her grandmother had embroidered with small blue birds along the hem. By the time she came downstairs at 7:15 on the morning of her 18th birthday, her eyes were dry and her chest was a hollow stone corridor, where feelings echoed but could not find walls to stick to. She unfolded the letter. The creases were sharp and precise, the way her mother folded everything hospital corners on beds, exact thirds on permission slips. Chidinma did not believe in sloppiness. Sloppiness was a luxury for people who had never had to prove they deserved to be in the room. The letter read, "Amara, we love you, but we cannot watch you make these choices. When you are ready to be serious about your life, you know where to find us." That was all. No explanation of what the choices were, as if the choices were so obvious and so grievous that naming them would be redundant. No mention of the arguments that had consumed the last 13 months of dinners, car rides, and Sunday afternoons in the kitchen, where the smell of her mother's jollof rice mingled with the acrid residue of conversations that went nowhere but deeper into damage. She picked up the envelope. Inside was $300 in 20s folded once crisp from the ATM. Not enough to start a life. Enough to delay the end of one briefly, if you were careful, and if you did not eat much, and if you were willing to sleep in rooms where the sheets smelled like strangers. Amara tucked the letter into the inside pocket of her denim jacket. She slid the envelope into the front pouch of the wheat-colored canvas tote bag that hung from her left shoulder. The bag her grandmother had given her 4 years ago. The bag that held her leather journal and 2 pens and a phone charger and a tube of cocoa butter lotion. She picked up the suitcase handle with her right hand. It clicked into the extended position with a sound like a small bone breaking. She looked up at the second floor. The window of her parents' bedroom faced the street. The curtain moved, not much, just enough. A hand pulling fabric aside an inch, holding it, then releasing. Someone was watching her leave. Someone who could have come downstairs but chose the window. Instead chose to witness the departure from a distance that allowed for deniability. She did not wave. She did not call out. She turned and walked down the porch steps and along the concrete path that bisected the small front lawn past the mailbox where the acceptance letter had arrived 5 months ago and detonated the fragile architecture of the Nwosu family like a grenade wrapped in university letterhead. At the sidewalk, she turned left toward the bus stop on Harvard Street. She did not look back at the house because looking back would mean she believed there was something behind her worth returning to. And she needed to not believe that right now. She needed to believe that everything worth keeping was in the canvas bag on her shoulder and the gold ring on her right index finger. The ring with the tiny turquoise stone that caught the June morning light and threw a speck of blue-green onto the denim of her jacket like a small defiant star. The ring had belonged to her grandmother. Nneka Nwosu had been the most important person in Amara's life, and she had been dead for 4 years, and there was not a single day in those 4 years that Amara had not touched the ring and felt the echo of a love so unconditional it almost didn't seem real in a family where love came with terms and conditions, printed in a font too small to read until you had already signed. Nneka had come to live with the family in her final years, staying in the guest room that Amara's father had converted from his home office, a sacrifice Emeka made without complaint. but also without warmth, the way he did most things that were correct but not chosen. Neka filled the Brookline house with things it had never contained before. The smell of egusi soup simmering on the stove with the perfect amount of crayfish. The sound of laughter that came from somewhere deep in the belly and didn't care who heard it. The sight of an old woman's hands moving through a young girl's hair braiding. Twisting, pulling, gently teaching the geometry of self-care that was also the geometry of inheritance. Naneka taught Amara to read clouds. When the clouds stretched into long parallel bands like the spine of a fish, she said, rain was coming tomorrow. When the clouds piled up in towers with flat, dark bottoms, she said the storm was already on its way, and you should bring in the laundry and close the windows and sit by the window with a cup of tea and watch. Neka believed that weather was a conversation and that most people had forgotten how to listen. She gave Amara the ring on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Amara was 12. They were sitting on the back porch of the Brookline house, Neka in the wooden chair with the green cushion, Amara on the steps. Both of them watching a flock of starlings wheel and turn against a sky the color of old pewter. Neka reached down and took Amara's right hand and slid the ring onto her index finger. The band was slightly too large, but the weight of it felt important, the way important things always feel slightly too heavy for the body that receives them. One day this ring will travel somewhere you do not expect. Neka's voice was quiet, almost conspiratorial, as though she were letting Amara in on a secret the universe had told her in confidence. Rings know things, child. Amara had laughed because she was 12, and the idea of jewelry having knowledge was funny. The way fairy tales are funny, not because they are absurd, but because they are true in a way that embarrasses the rational mind. She had wrapped her left hand around the ring on her right index finger and squeezed, and the turquoise stone pressed into her palm like a tiny cold heartbeat. 2 years later, Neka was dead. Pneumonia, the doctor said. Though Amara suspected it was something less clinical, something more like the body deciding it had carried enough weight for enough years, and setting the weight down the way you set down a heavy bag at the end of a long walk. Not with drama, but with relief. Neka died in the guest room of the Brookline house, in the bed that had been Emeka's office desk 6 years earlier, with the window open because she had asked for the window to be open, and Chidinma had opened it even though it was February, and the heating bill was already obscene. Amara had been at school when it happened. She came home to find her father sitting at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes focused on a point somewhere between the salt shaker and the napkin holder. A point that did not exist in physical space, but existed very much in the space where grief lives before it has a name. Her mother was on the phone in the hallway speaking in Igbo to someone. Amara could not identify her voice carrying the particular tone of a woman who is managing logistics, because logistics are the only thing she knows how to manage when everything else has become unmanageable. The funeral was held far away. Amara asked to go. Her parents said it was too far, too expensive, too disruptive to her school year. She understood the reasoning. She understood that plane tickets cost money, and that missing a week of ninth grade was not nothing, and that her parents made decisions based on a calculus of practicality that had been drilled into them by decades of being immigrants in a country that did not give second chances to people who could not demonstrate at every moment that they were serious about succeeding. She understood all of this, and it broke something in her that never quite healed. Not a dramatic break, not a bone snapping, but the slow fracture of a thing that was already under stress. The way a crack in a foundation spreads a little more each winter when the water gets in and freezes and expands and melts and leaves the crack wider than it was before. By the time Amara was 18, the crack ran through everything she felt about her parents, and the ring on her finger was the only seal that kept the whole structure from collapsing entirely. She touched it when she was nervous. She touched it when she was writing. She touched it when she needed to remember that somewhere in the world or somewhere beyond it, a woman had loved her without asking her to become someone else first. Naneka had loved books. She loved the thick, chewy novels of Chinua Achebe and the sharp, precise stories of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. But she also loved with an intensity that surprised everyone who knew her, the poetry of Appalachia. She had discovered Wendell Berry through a dog-eared paperback she found in a second-hand bookshop in Cambridge, and she had fallen into his work the way certain people fall into landscapes they have never visited, but recognize immediately the way you sometimes recognize a place in a dream and know you have never been there, and also know you belong. She read Berry's poems aloud to Amara on the back porch, the same porch where she would later give her the ring, her voice wrapping around lines about soil and roots, and the obligation to stay in one place long enough to understand it. This man understands something important, Neka told Amara. He understands that the land does not belong to the person. The person belongs to the land. Amara was 10 when she heard that, and she filed it in the part of her brain where she kept things that did not yet make sense, but felt like they would eventually, the way seeds do not make sense until you see the flower. Now she was 18 and walking toward a bus stop with a suitcase and $300 and a grandmother's ring and a grandmother's words rattling around in her hollow chest like stones in a gourd. And the flower was still underground, still unsprouted, still waiting for the right combination of rain and desperation. Her parents were not villains. This is important to say because the story will not work if you think of Emeka and Chidinmanosu as monsters. And they were not monsters. They were two people who had crossed an ocean with almost nothing and built something from the almost nothing. And the building had cost them more than they would ever admit. And the something they had built was so precious and so fragile that they could not tolerate any threat to its structural integrity, even if the threat came from inside, even if the threat wore their daughter's face and spoke with their daughter's voice and wanted nothing more dangerous than to write poems. Emeka Nwosu arrived in America in 1994 with $400 in his pocket, a partial scholarship to a state university in Massachusetts, and a conviction that engineering was not a passion, but a survival strategy. He had grown up watching his own father, a school teacher with beautiful handwriting, and no savings die slowly of the particular disease that kills men who are brilliant but poor in countries where brilliance without capital is a decorative affliction. Emeka decided early that he would not die that way. He would not die of beauty. He would die old and comfortable and in a house he owned with a refrigerator that was always full and a daughter who would never have to choose between her dignity and her dinner. He slept on the floor of a dormitory room for 2 years because the scholarship covered tuition, but not housing. And the housing he could afford was the hospitality of a classmate from Accra who let him use half the floor space in exchange for help with calculus homework. He ate ramen noodles for 6 months, the cheap kind, the kind that came in bricks with flavor packets that tasted like someone had described chicken to a chemist, and the chemist had done his best. He sent money home to his younger sister every month. Money he earned tutoring undergraduates in physics because his sister wanted to be a pharmacist, and pharmacists needed degrees and degrees needed money, and money was the only language the world reliably understood. He married Chidinma in 1998. She was a nurse. She had come to America 2 years after him through a family reunification petition that took 14 months to process and required letters of support from 3 American citizens and a stack of paperwork that would have discouraged anyone who was not already accustomed to being discouraged and persisting anyway. Chidinma worked 12-hour night shifts at a hospital in Boston for the first 10 years of their marriage. She worked nights because the night differential paid more, and because nights were the shifts no one else wanted. And Chidinma had built her entire career on a willingness to do what no one else wanted. She came home at 7 in the morning, slept until 2 in the afternoon, woke up to help Amara with homework, cooked dinner, left for work at 6:30 in the evening. For the first 3 years of Amara's life, Chidinma later admitted in a moment of exhausted candor. During an argument about something else entirely, she could not have picked her daughter's face out of a lineup of toddlers because she was never home during the hours when Amara's face was awake and lit by daylight. She loved her daughter. Let there be no confusion about this. Chidinma loved Amara with a ferocity that frightened her sometimes, a love so large and so terrified that it could not express itself in tenderness, but only in vigilance, in the ironing of school uniforms at 5:30 in the morning, in the casseroles left in the refrigerator, with heating instructions written on sticky notes in her small, neat handwriting, in the quiet crying she did in the bathroom. After arguments, crying Amara was never supposed to hear, but sometimes heard anyway through the thin walls of the Brookline house, the sound of a woman trying to hold the shape of her love together, even as it cracked under the pressure of its own expectations. Emeka expressed his love differently, which is to say, he expressed it in a way that required interpretation. The way certain poems require interpretation. The way a gesture can mean something enormous if you know the language of the person making it, and can mean nothing if you do not. Every morning for 18 years, Emeka woke at 5:30 before anyone else in the house and went down to the kitchen and prepared Amara's school bag, checking that her homework was inside, that her pencil case was zipped, that her lunch was packed. And then he placed a single apple on the kitchen table. Red apple, always red, always placed at the exact center of the table, as if the table were a stage, and the apple were the only actor. And the play it was performing was a one-word monologue that said everything Emeka could not. He never said, "I love you." The apple said it for him. And Amara understood this the way children understand the private languages of their parents. And she ate the apple every morning on the bus to school, and sometimes pressed her tongue against the skin before biting, and tasted not just fruit but the entire complicated devotion of a man who had slept on a floor and eaten chemical noodles and sent money to his sister and married a woman who worked nights, all so that his daughter could eat a red apple on a bus in a country where the buses ran on time and the apples were unblemished, and the future was something you could plan for rather than something that happened to you, like weather. The tension began when Amara started writing. Not the casual writing that all children do, the school assignments and thank you notes and journal entries that are a normal part of growing up literate in a house full of books. The other kind, the kind that takes over. The kind that makes a person sit at a desk for 3 hours and forget to eat, forget to shower, forget that the world outside the notebook exists and has demands and expectations and a clock. The kind that fills notebook after notebook with poems and story fragments and observations so precise they feel like surgery, the careful cutting open of the ordinary world to reveal the strange and luminous organs inside. Amara started writing seriously at 14, the year her grandmother died. The timing was not coincidental. Grief needs a container. And for Amara, the container was language the way it had been language for Neka too, who had read poems aloud on the porch and believed that words could hold the shape of things that hands could not. She filled the leather journal Neka had given her. She bought more notebooks. She wrote in the margins of her school books, in the blank spaces of math tests on napkins at the kitchen table, while her mother cooked and her father read engineering journals. And the house hummed with the particular silence of a family that has many things to say and no safe way to say them. She published in her school's literary magazine. The faculty advisor, a woman named Miss Fenton, who wore scarves and said things like your voice has edges in a way that made Amara feel seen in a building where feeling seen was rare, encouraged her to submit to regional contests. Amara submitted. At 16, she won a small poetry prize for a poem about her grandmother and the ring. The poem was called What the Turquoise Holds, and it was published in a pamphlet with a blue cover that Amara kept in the Converse tote bag next to her journal, and she read it to herself sometimes on the bus home from school. Not because she had forgotten the words, but because hearing her own words in her own voice made her feel like she existed in a way that her grades and her silence and her careful performance of good immigrant daughter did not. Her parents read the published poem. Her father held the pamphlet in both hands and looked at it for a long time, and his face did something complicated that Amara could not read. Something that might have been pride, or might have been fear, or might have been the particular expression of a man who sees his child walking toward a cliff he knows is there, because he has fallen off it himself. The cliff where talent meets economics and economics usually wins. That is nice, Amara. Her mother's voice was warm but already turning, already pivoting toward the question that was always next. The question that hovered over every accomplishment like a hawk over a field mouse. Have you looked at the pre-med program at Boston University yet? Amara had not looked at the pre-med program at Boston University. She had looked at it the way you look at a prison brochure that someone has left on your desk as a suggestion. She had turned the pages and read the words and understood the information, and felt nothing except the slow, cold contraction of a future closing around her, like a fist. At 17, she did something brave and possibly stupid, which is often the same thing. She applied without telling her parents to a prestigious creative writing program at a university in New England. The program accepted 12 students per year from a pool of over 1,000 applicants. The tuition was astronomical. The reputation was impeccable. The graduates went on to publish books and win prizes and live lives that looked from the outside like the lives of people who had solved the ancient riddle of how to be both serious and alive. She got in. The acceptance letter arrived in the mail on a Tuesday in January, in a thick cream-colored envelope with the university's seal embossed in navy blue. Emeka got to the mailbox first. He always got to the mailbox first. He brought the mail inside and sorted it on the kitchen table the way he sorted everything methodically, without haste, giving each item the respect of his attention before moving to the next. When he reached the cream envelope, he stopped. He read the return address. He opened the envelope with his thumb carefully along the top seam, the way he opened everything, as though the act of opening were itself a kind of engineering that deserved precision. He read the letter. He set it on the kitchen table. He did not say a word. He went to the living room and sat in his chair and opened an engineering journal to a page he had already read and stared at it. Chaitanya came home from a day shift at 4:30 and found the letter on the table. She read it standing up, her purse still on her shoulder, her keys still in her hand. Then she set the letter down and went to the living room where Emeka was pretending to read. They talked for over an hour. In Igbo, the door was closed. Amara sat at the top of the stairs and listened to the rhythm of a conversation she could only partially understand, because she had never fully learned the language her parents reverted to when the stakes were too high for English. She caught fragments. The word for money, the word for future, the word for foolish, which in Igbo carries a weight that the English equivalent does not, a connotation, not just of poor judgment, but of moral failure, of a willingness to squander what has been given to you by people who bled for it. That evening, her parents called her to the kitchen. The letter was on the table between them, like a piece of evidence at a trial. The kitchen smelled like palm oil and onions. The fluorescent light above the stove buzzed the way it always buzzed, a sound Amara had heard every day of her life and would hear in her memory for years after she left, the soundtrack of a room where love and control were so thoroughly braided together that pulling them apart would destroy them both. Her father spoke first. His voice was level. He had the particular calm of a man who has already made a decision and is now performing the courtesy of announcing it. We cannot pay for this program, Amara, and we will not. Writing is not a career. It is a hobby, and you cannot build a life on a hobby. Her mother spoke next, and her voice was the opposite of level. It shook. Not with anger, though anger was there, but with something underneath the anger. Something that sounded like grief wearing anger's clothes. Do you know what your father and I gave up so you could have this life? He slept on a floor for 2 years. I worked nights until I could not remember what my own daughter looked like in daylight. All of it, every sacrifice, every meal we skipped, every dollar we did not spend on ourselves, was so that you would have opportunities, real opportunities. And you want to use those opportunities to write poems. The question was not really a question. It was a closing argument. The verdict was already in. Amara could see it in the way her father's hands were flat on the table, the same position they had been in the day Neka died, the position of a man who has placed his palms on a surface to keep himself from shaking. If you want to be a writer, you can be a writer somewhere else. Her mother's voice had steadied now, the tremor replaced by something harder, something that had been forged in night shifts and hospital corridors, and the relentless arithmetic of immigrant survival. Not on our money, not in this house. Amara looked at her mother. She looked at her father. She looked at the acceptance letter on the table, the cream paper glowing under the fluorescent light, like a small flag of surrender. She did not argue. She had learned years ago that arguing with her parents was like punching a brick wall. The wall does not move. You only break your own hands. She went upstairs to her room and closed the door and sat on her bed and opened the leather journal and wrote for 2 hours without stopping. She wrote about what she was feeling, which was not anger and not sadness, but something between them. Something that did not have a name in English or in Igbo. Something that lives in the space between the love you receive and the love you need and is shaped like the distance between those two things. She wrote about what her grandmother would have said, which she did not know exactly, but could guess because Neka was a woman who believed that the land does not belong to the person. The person belongs to the land. And if the land you are standing on does not want you, you find the land that does. She wrote about what she was going to do next, which she did not know yet. But the act of writing it, of putting pen to paper, and letting the pen move without a plan, felt like the beginning of a direction. The way the first step of a walk is not yet a destination, but is already a departure. She graduated from high school that June. She walked across the stage and shook the principal's hand and moved the tassel from one side of the cap to the other and smiled for the photograph her mother took. Because even now, even after everything her mother wanted photographs, her mother still believed in the archival function of happiness. The importance of documenting the moments that looked like success, even if the spaces between them were filled with fractures. 2 weeks later, on the morning of her 18th birthday, Amara came downstairs and understood immediately that something had shifted. The house felt different, not empty because both her parents were home, her father in the living room, in his chair, her mother somewhere upstairs behind the closed bedroom door, but rearranged the way a room feels after furniture has been moved, and the indentations in the carpet are still visible where the old positions used to be. The suitcase was by the front door, the letter was on top, the envelope was beside it, and the kitchen table where she always ate breakfast before school, where her father always left the apple, where the fluorescent light always buzzed, and the salt shaker always stood next to the napkin holder, was empty. No apple. No cereal bowl set out, no napkin, nothing. For the first time in 18 years, the table was bare, and the bareness of it hit Amara harder than the suitcase, harder than the letter, harder than the locked door and the moving curtain, and the $300 in an envelope. The table was bare because her father had not woken up at 5:30 this morning to prepare it. He had stayed in bed or in his chair, and he had let the morning pass without performing the one small act of love he had performed every day since she was old enough to eat solid food. The apple was gone, and the absence of the apple said what the letter did not. That this was not a negotiation, not a test, not a threat designed to bring her to her senses. This was finished. She read the letter on the porch. She read it twice. She picked up the suitcase and the envelope and the canvas tote bag with the journal inside, and she walked off the porch and down the path and past the mailbox and turned left on Harvard Street toward the bus stop. And she did not look back, and the ring on her finger caught the morning light and threw a speck of blue-green onto her jacket, and the speck moved with her as she walked, a tiny traveling star that had once belonged to a woman who believed rings know things. The hostel was on a side street in Chinatown, sandwiched between a dry cleaner and a restaurant supply store. It cost $35 a night for a bed in a shared room with 3 other beds, a communal bathroom down the hall, and a common room on the ground floor, with a coffee machine that dispensed a liquid that was technically coffee, in the same way that a photocopy is technically a document. Amara checked in with her debit card, counted her remaining money, and understood with the flat clarity of basic arithmetic that $300 minus $105 for 3 nights was $195, and $195 minus food was less than $195, and less than $195 was not a life plan but a countdown. She spent the first day applying for jobs: retail, food service, data entry. She walked into a bookstore on Newbury Street and asked if they were hiring. And the manager, a kind-looking man with a beard and glasses, said they were not. But she could leave a resume, and Amara did not have a resume because she was 18 years old, and her only marketable skill was the ability to arrange words in patterns that made people feel things. And that skill, as her parents had accurately identified, was not currently in high commercial demand. She spent the second day calling the writing program. The admissions counselor was a woman with a gentle voice and the careful diction of someone trained in delivering disappointing news with compassion. Without her parents' cooperation on the FAFSA, the counselor explained, Amara could not demonstrate financial need through the standard channels. There were override procedures for students from abusive households, but the process took months, and even then the aid might not cover enough. The counselor was sorry. She said the word sorry 3 times in 4 minutes each time with slightly less conviction. The way a word loses its meaning when you use it to describe a system that is functioning exactly as designed. On the third night, Amara lay in the hostel bed and listened to the woman in the next bed breathing, and the man 2 beds over snoring, and the sound of traffic on the street below, and the coffee machine in the common room cycling on and off for no reason. And she thought about her grandmother's hands braiding her hair, and her grandmother's voice reading poems on the back porch, and the weight of the turquoise ring on her finger, which she could feel even in the dark. Especially in the dark, because darkness is where the things you carry become most apparent. The way stars are always there, but you can only see them when the sun has the decency to leave. On the fourth morning, she sat in the common room with her laptop and her journal, and a cup of the machine coffee and $160 left in the world, and tried to think. She opened the laptop. The screen glowed in the dim room. She typed the words that would change her life, though she did not know it yet. Because the moments that change your life never announce themselves. They arrive disguised as ordinary actions, as keystrokes and bus tickets and $1 coins, and the small decisions that do not feel like decisions until much later. When you look back and see the hinge, she searched cheap property rural America homestead program. The results were mostly irrelevant. Clickbait articles about tiny houses, real estate listings that defined cheap as anything under $300,000, which was a definition that would have been funny if Amara had been in a position to find anything funny. Forums where people discussed off-grid living with the enthusiasm of hobbyists for whom poverty was a lifestyle choice rather than a condition. But on the third page of results, between an article about a man in Vermont who had built a house out of shipping containers and a listicle titled 10 Towns That Will Pay You to Move There, she found something different. A link to a county government website. McDowell County, West Virginia. She clicked. The page was plain. Government websites are always plain, designed by people who understand function but not beauty, which is the opposite of Amara, who understood beauty but was still learning function. The page listed properties available through the county's rural homestead revival program. Abandoned homes mostly. Houses and cabins left behind when the coal mines closed. And the people who had built their lives around the mines followed the mines into oblivion, leaving behind structures that sat empty on hillsides and in hollows, slowly returning to the earth that had provided the stone and timber from which they were made. Most of the listings were modest. A frame house in a former mining town for $500. A double-wide trailer on a quarter-acre for $300. A commercial building that had once been a general store for $1,000. But one listing was different. Stone cabin on half-acre of land, located approximately 2.5 miles from the township of Elkhorn, McDowell County, West Virginia. Structure dates to approximately 1870. Abandoned since 1953. Single-room stone construction, slate roof. partial collapse, stone chimney, well water. No electric service, no paved road access. Property title held by McDowell County through lapsed inheritance. Available through Rural Homestead Revival Program. Price $1. Conditions: buyer must commit to restoration or preservation within 5 years. Buyer must register as resident of McDowell County. Buyer must respect the cultural and historical significance of the structure. $1. Amara stared at the listing. She read it twice. She read the conditions. She read the description again. Stone cabin, half acre. Abandoned since 1953. $1. She thought about the numbers. A bus ticket from Boston to Charleston, West Virginia. The nearest city with a Greyhound station cost approximately $65. From Charleston, a local bus into McDowell County, maybe another $15 or $20. A few nights in a cheap motel while she figured things out, say $25 a night for 3 nights, $75. Total outlay roughly $160, which was almost exactly what she had left. There would be nothing remaining after that. Nothing for food, nothing for emergencies, nothing for the return trip. If the cabin turned out to be uninhabitable, or the program turned out to be a dead end, or the whole idea turned out to be the kind of desperate fantasy that people construct when they are 18 and broke and sitting in a hostel common room at 7 in the morning with bad coffee and no plan. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about Wendell Berry. She thought about the land does not belong to the person belongs to the land. She thought about clouds shaped like fish spines and the rain that follows. She touched the turquoise ring on her right index finger. The stone was cool. It was always cool even in summer, as though it carried its own climate, a small pocket of permanence in a world that would not stop changing. Rings know things. She closed the laptop. She opened her journal. She wrote one sentence: I am going to West Virginia to buy a house for $1. The sentence looked insane on the page. It looked like the kind of thing a person writes before making a terrible decision. The kind of decision that shows up later in a cautionary tale told by parents to their children, as evidence that creativity leads to ruin. But it also looked in the pale morning light of the hostel common room like the truest thing she had ever written. She bought the bus ticket that afternoon. Greyhound departing Boston South Station at 9:45 p.m., arriving Charleston, West Virginia at 11:30 the next morning. 14 hours through Connecticut and New York and Pennsylvania, and the long diagonal descent into the Appalachian Mountains where the highway carved through hills so green and so ancient that they looked less like geography and more like the earth remembering something it had dreamed a long time ago. She boarded the bus with her suitcase stowed underneath and her canvas tote bag on her lap and her journal open to the page where she had written the sentence about buying a house for $1. She was the youngest person on the bus by at least a decade. The man in the seat next to her was asleep before they left the station, his head against the window, his breathing deep and regular. The breathing of a person for whom bus travel was not an adventure, but a commute. A thing you endured between the place you were leaving and the place you had not yet arrived. Amara watched Boston slide away through the window. The city lights thinned and scattered as the bus moved south and west, the buildings shrinking the spaces between them, growing the darkness of the countryside, asserting itself the way darkness does. When you leave a city not gradually, but in a sudden claim, as though the darkness had been waiting just outside the reach of the streetlights and was relieved to finally have the sky to itself. She slept. She woke. She slept again. The bus stopped in Hartford and she did not get off. It stopped in Scranton and she bought a granola bar from a vending machine in the station and ate it standing by the bus in the cold pre-dawn air, the mountains around her black against a sky that was just beginning to remember what blue was. She arrived in Charleston, West Virginia at 11:22 in the morning. The bus station was small and smelled like diesel and floor cleaner. She found the local transit counter and asked about buses to McDowell County. The woman behind the counter, who had the particular expression of someone who has answered the same question many times and has stopped being surprised by anything, told her there was a bus to Welch at 1:15. Welch was the county seat of McDowell County. From Welch, she would need to find local transportation to wherever she was going. Though the woman did not say this with confidence because local transportation in McDowell County was not so much a system as a series of informal arrangements between people who had trucks and people who needed rides. Amara bought the ticket. She sat in the station and ate a sandwich from the vending machine and read her journal and waited. At 1:15, she boarded a bus that was smaller than the Greyhound older, with seats that had been reupholstered in a fabric that could not decide if it was blue or gray, and had settled on a color that was neither. The bus climbed out of Charleston and into the mountains, and the world changed. The highway became a two-lane road. The two-lane road became a winding corridor through hills that rose on both sides like green walls so steep and so close that the sky narrowed to a ribbon overhead. Trees pressed in from every direction. Oaks and chestnuts and maples, their branches interlocking above the road to form a canopy that filtered the afternoon light into something golden and green and alive with movement. Creeks appeared alongside the road, running fast over smooth stones, catching the light and throwing it back in chips of silver. The air that came through the cracked windows smelled like wet earth and something sweet that Amara could not identify, something botanical and ancient, the smell of a place that has been growing for longer than anyone can remember. And then the other things, the houses that were no longer houses, their roofs caved in their windows, dark and empty, their porches sagging under the weight of years. The rusted railroad tracks that ran parallel to the creek. The tracks that had once carried coal cars to the processing plants and now carried nothing but rainwater and the memory of an industry that had fed the nation and left this place starving. The gas stations with boarded windows. The signs for businesses that no longer existed, their paint fading, their letters dropping off one by one, the slow alphabet of abandonment. McDowell County had once been one of the wealthiest counties in West Virginia. Coal had made it rich. Coal had built the towns, the schools, the churches, the railroad, the company stores, where miners bought their groceries with scrip that was worth less than money, but was the only currency the company honored. And then the coal had thinned, or the machines had replaced the men, or the markets had shifted, or all of these things at once, and the wealth had drained out of McDowell County, the way water drains from a bathtub when you pull the plug slowly at first, and then all at once leaving behind nothing but the ring of grime around the edges to mark where the waterline used to be. Amara looked through the bus window at the green hills and the ruined houses and the creeks that kept running even though everything around them had stopped, and she thought, this place is like me, left behind but not dead. The bus arrived in Welch at 4:17 in the afternoon. Amara stepped off with her suitcase and her tote bag and stood on the sidewalk of a town that felt like it was holding its breath between one century and the next, not quite alive and not quite willing to admit. It was dying, suspended in the amber of its own history, like an insect in resin, perfectly preserved and perfectly still. She touched the ring. The turquoise was cool. The sun was going down behind the western ridge of the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and the shadows of the hills were reaching across the valley floor like long dark fingers. And Amara Nusu stood on a sidewalk in a dying coal town, in the poorest county in one of the poorest states, in the richest country in the world, and she had a canvas bag and a leather journal and a gold ring and absolutely no idea what she was doing. But she was doing it, and that for now was enough. The county office was in a brick building beside the old courthouse, the kind of building that had been important once and was now important only to the people who still worked inside it, which was three. A woman at a desk behind a counter with a sliding glass window that had been propped open with a wooden doorstop because the mechanism that was supposed to hold it open had broken sometime during the second Bush administration, and no one had ever fixed it. Betty Combs was 62 years old, and she had been the clerk of McDowell County's property office for 25 years, which meant she had watched the county lose roughly half its population during her tenure and had processed the paperwork for every foreclosure, every tax default, every lapsed inheritance, every abandoned property that the county had absorbed into its inventory the way a body absorbs a bruise slowly and with discoloration. She had silver hair cut short and practical gold-rimmed reading glasses that she wore on a chain around her neck, and the particular expression of a woman who has seen enough to be surprised by nothing, but has retained enough warmth to be kind about it. She looked up when Amara walked in. She looked at the girl standing in front of her counter, a young black woman with a backpack and tired eyes, and a printed sheet of paper from the county website clutched in her right hand. And she looked at the paper, and she looked back at the girl. "You came from Boston." Betty's voice carried the thick, rolling vowels of the Appalachian accent, the kind of accent that television had taught the rest of America to associate with ignorance, but that actually carried a precision and a musicality that most other American dialects had long since traded for efficiency. "Yes, ma'am, for the Harlan cabin. That stone place up on the ridge, yes, ma'am." Betty set the paper down on the counter and removed her reading glasses and held them in her left hand and studied Amara's face with the unhurried attention of someone who understood that decisions made in this office, however small they seemed, had consequences that would outlast the paperwork. 25 years I've sat at this desk and no one has ever come from Boston to buy a dollar house. Most of the inquiries we get are phone calls from out-of-state investors who want to buy 10 properties at once, flip them, put up vacation rentals. They never come in person. They never actually want to live here. She paused. Her eyes moved from Amara's face to the backpack, measuring the weight of it, the weariness of the shoulders that carried it. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honest. Are you sure about this? That cabin has been empty since 1953. The roof is partially collapsed. The chimney is damaged. There's no electricity for miles in that direction. And you'd need to either run a line which costs more money than the cabin is worth, or go without. The well might still be good, but it needs testing. You'd be living 2.5 miles from the nearest paved road, and in winter that 2.5 miles might as well be 20. It is a hard place." "I'm sure, ma'am. I don't have anywhere else to go." The sentence sat between them on the counter next to the printed listing, and Betty's reading glasses, and a jar of pens with the county seal on them. "I don't have anywhere else to go." It was not a sentence designed to elicit pity. It was a statement of geography. Amara was telling Betty where she was on the map of her own life, and where she was at the edge. Betty looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached into her purse, which was hanging on the back of her chair, and took out a coin, a single dollar. She placed it on the counter next to the listing. "Keep your money for food, child. This dollar is on me." She pulled a form from a drawer and began filling it out in handwriting that was small and neat and surprisingly elegant for a government document. She wrote Amara's name carefully, asking for the spelling twice, and she wrote the property description and the sale price and the conditions and the date, and she stamped the form with the county seal and signed it and slid it across the counter. "Welcome to McDowell County, Amara Nusu." Amara walked to the cabin the next morning. She had spent the night in a motel at the edge of Welch, a single-story building with a neon sign that read, Mountaineer Inn, in letters that had once been red and were now a faded pink that looked like the building was blushing with embarrassment at its own decline. The room cost $25 and smelled like pine cleaner, and contained a bed with a quilt that someone's grandmother had made the stitching uneven but tight. The kind of imperfection that only handwork produces, and that machines have never figured out how to replicate, because machines do not understand that a flaw can be a form of love. She left the motel at 8 in the morning with her backpack. She had transferred everything she needed from the suitcase into the backpack and left the suitcase in the motel room, because you cannot roll a suitcase down a dirt path through the Appalachian woods. And Amara was done carrying things that did not serve the life she was walking toward. The road from Welch climbed into the hills. Pavement gave way to gravel. Gravel gave way to dirt. Dirt gave way to a path that was more suggestion than infrastructure. A narrow line between two dry stone walls that ran through a landscape so green and so quiet that it felt less like walking through nature and more like walking into a painting that had been waiting for someone to enter it. Oak trees, chestnut trees, ferns growing thick in the shade of the stone walls. The sound of a creek somewhere to the left, invisible but audible, the water running over stones, with a sound like continuous unhurried applause. A blue jay screamed from a branch above her, the sharp electric cry cutting through the green silence, like a wire through cloth. She came around a bend in the path at the top of a gentle ridge, and the cabin was there. She stopped walking. She adjusted the straps of her backpack. She stood on the path and looked at it for a full minute without moving, because some things need to be seen whole before you approach them. The way you stand back from a painting in a museum before you step close to examine the brushwork. It was smaller than she had imagined, rougher, more beautiful. The stones were gray and irregular, cut from the mountain itself, fitted together with a precision that spoke of hands that understood weight and balance and the particular patience required to build something that would outlast the builder by a century and a half. Moss covered the north-facing stones in patches of bright green. The mortar between the stones had crumbled in places, but the stones themselves held their positions leaning into each other, the way old couples lean not from weakness but from the accumulated habit of mutual support. She pushed the oak door open. The hinges produced a sound that was less a creak and more a groan, the complaint of iron that had not been asked to work in 70 years and resented being woken. The door held. Inside the single room was exactly what the listing had described, and also something the listing could never have described, because listings deal in dimensions and conditions and government language, and what Amara walked into was not a room, but a held breath, a space that had been waiting. The flagstone floor was covered in dust and small pieces of fallen slate from the damaged section of the roof. A column of daylight fell through the gap in the ceiling and landed on the floor, in a bright irregular rectangle, the only illumination in the room, except for the gray light that filtered through the two dirty windows. The walls rose around her, rough stone, uneven, textured with the marks of the tools that had shaped them, and they were beautiful in the way that only handmade things are beautiful, carrying in their surfaces the evidence of the hands that made them. And at the far end of the room, the hearth. It occupied nearly the entire north wall. It was enormous. A fireplace built for cooking and heating and surviving winters that could last 5 months and bury the world in white. The opening was wide enough and tall enough to stand inside, and the interior was black with the residue of a century of fires. An iron crane still hung from a hook on the inner wall, the arm extending out over the firebox, designed to hold pots over the flames. Above the fireplace, a rough wooden shelf ran the width of the wall, empty now except for dust and a few trailing cobwebs that swayed in the draught from the broken roof. The hearthstone was the largest single piece of stone in the room, 5 feet wide, 3 feet deep, set directly in front of the fireplace opening, like a threshold between the room and the fire, between the present and everything that had burned here before. It was dark with ash and soothed the surface almost black. But Amara could see beneath the grime that it was a single massive slab of gray stone, thick as a man's forearm, heavy beyond easy calculation. She knelt in front of the hearth. She placed her right palm flat on the hearthstone. The stone was cold. Not the cold of a surface that the sun has not reached, but a deeper cold, the cold of something that has been holding its temperature for a very long time, the cold of patience. She stayed like that, breathing, letting the room settle around her, letting the fact of where she was and what she had done catch up to the body that had done it. She was in a cabin in the mountains of West Virginia. She had bought it for $1. She had spent her last money getting here. She had nothing left except notebooks and a ring, and the slowly dawning understanding that she was either brave or insane, and that the difference between those two things is usually only visible in retrospect. When she lifted her hand, she noticed the gap, a thin line of shadow along the edge of the hearthstone where it met the surrounding flagstones. Not a crack in the stone itself, a seam, deliberate. The edge of the hearthstone, when she brushed away the ash with her fingertips, was smooth, cut smooth. The hearthstone was not mortared to the floor. It was not fixed. It was sitting on something resting in its position the way a lid rests on a box. She pressed one edge. Nothing. She pressed the opposite edge. The stone shifted, a fraction of an inch. A movement so small it might have been imagined, except that stone does not imagine and does not lie. She went outside and found a rusted iron bar in the remains of the garden, possibly a fence post from a time when the garden had a fence and the fence had a purpose. She brought it inside and wedged one end into the gap along the hearthstone's edge and leaned her weight onto the other end. The stone rose, slowly, grudgingly, the way heavy things rise when they have been in one position for 70 years and have settled into the particular stubbornness of objects that have not been asked to move in living memory. 200 pounds of Appalachian fieldstone tilting up on one edge, revealing a darkness beneath. That was not the darkness of empty space, but the darkness of contained space, the darkness of something that has been sealed. Beneath the hearthstone was a chamber, rectangular, approximately 2 feet wide, 3 feet long, 2 feet deep, lined on all sides with flat stones, fitted together with the same care as the walls of the cabin itself. Not a natural cavity, not an accident of construction, a hiding place, built with intention, built to hold something through whatever might come. Inside the chamber, resting on the stone floor of the space, was a bundle wrapped in dark oilcloth and tied with heavy twine. Amara eased the hearthstone back into position carefully, because dropping 200 pounds of stone would crack the flagstone floor and probably several of her toes. And then she reached into the chamber and lifted out the bundle. It was heavy, heavier than it looked. She carried it to the wooden shelf above the mantel and set it down and stood in front of it and looked at it the way you look at a gift you have not yet opened. When you already know from the weight and the shape and the care with which it was wrapped that whatever is inside will change the terms of your life. She untied the twine. She unfolded the oilcloth. The fabric was thick and stiff with age, dark brown, waterproof, the kind of material that was designed to protect things from damp and time, and had done its job faithfully for 7 decades. Inside were 3 objects: a tin box with a hinged lid, a leather-bound ledger, a wooden rosary. She opened the tin box first. Inside, wrapped in a layer of waxed paper that crinkled under her fingers like dried leaves, were small gold objects. Jewelry, old jewelry. The kind made by hands that understood metalwork as a form of devotion, each piece carrying the evidence of hours spent with tiny tools and steady fingers, and the knowledge that beauty, when it is made by hand, becomes a repository for the time and attention of the person who made it. A pair of earrings set with small garnets, the stones dark red, the color of wine, held up to candlelight. A thin gold chain with a pendant in the shape of a cross, simple, unadorned, the gold worn smooth by decades of contact with a woman's collarbone. A ring with a single blue stone, the blue deep and steady, the color of a mountain lake in late afternoon. A gold locket on a chain oval, the surface engraved with a pattern of tiny flowers so fine that Amara had to hold it close to her eyes to see them. She opened the locket with her thumbnail gently, the hinge stiff but functional. Inside was a photograph. Small, black and white, the edges soft with age. A young couple. The man had dark hair and a mustache, and the straight-backed posture of someone who was either proud or nervous or both. The woman wore a pale dress and had flowers in her hair, and was looking at the camera with an expression that Amara recognized immediately. The expression of a person who knows that this moment is being preserved and wants to be worthy of the preservation. She set the locket down carefully and opened the ledger. The pages were thick and slightly rough, the kind of paper that absorbs ink rather than sitting under it, so that the writing seemed to live inside the paper rather than on its surface. The ink had faded from black to a warm brown, the color of coffee, the color of autumn, the color of things that were once vivid and have aged into gentleness. The handwriting was small, careful, and precise. the handwriting of a woman who had been taught penmanship in a one-room schoolhouse and had taken the lessons seriously. The first entry was dated 1939. My husband Thomas and I are leaving Appalachia tonight. Thomas has enlisted in the United States Army. He is a foolish man, but he says he cannot sit still while the world burns. And I have loved him for 12 years and have never once been able to talk him out of anything he has decided is right. I will work as a nurse at the military depot in Richmond, Virginia, because I am not the kind of woman who sits still either, though I am better at pretending. I am hiding this ledger, our savings, and the few pieces of jewelry that have been in our families for generations beneath the hearthstone, in the space my grandmother used to hide things during Prohibition, when the federal men came looking for moonshine. My grandmother was better at hiding things than the federal men were at finding them, which is a sentence that applies to most of the women in this family and most of the men who have tried to govern us. If we return, we will reclaim what is here. If we do not return, let this remain hidden until it is needed by whoever finds it. The hearth holds what the heart cannot carry. Ruth Harlan, August 1939. Amara read the entry. She read it again. She read the last line a third time, and the words arranged themselves in her chest in a configuration that felt permanent. The way certain sentences do, the sentences that find the exact shape of something you have been feeling, but could not name, and name it for you. And once named, it cannot be unnamed, and once felt in words, it cannot be unfelt. She turned the page. 1942. I came back to the cabin today for the first time since we left. Thomas is in North Africa. I pray every night. I have added more money to the hiding place and a pair of wool socks I knitted for him that I will not be able to send because I do not know exactly where he is, and the Army Postal Service is not equipped for the anxiety of wives. The cabin is holding up. The roof is sound. The chimney draws well. The roses I planted along the south wall are blooming without me, which is either a compliment to the roses or an indictment of how much they needed me in the first place. 1943. Thomas is in France. I have not received a letter in 6 weeks. They tell me this is normal. Normal is a word that people use when they cannot tell you the truth and want you to stop asking. Early 1945. A single entry, shorter than the others. The handwriting slightly less steady, the letters slightly larger, as if the hand that wrote them was pressing harder than usual, pushing the pen into the paper, the way you push your feet into the ground when you are trying not to fall. Thomas is dead, killed in Germany in March. I will go on. 4 words at the end. I will go on. Written with force. Written as instruction, not description. A woman telling herself what she would do next. The way you tell yourself to breathe when breathing has become a decision rather than a reflex. Amara held the ledger in both hands and felt the weight of it, which was not just the weight of paper and leather, but the weight of a woman's life compressed into entries that spanned 14 years and contained in their brevity and their precision more grief than most novels manage in 400 pages. She turned to the final entry, 1953. Today I am leaving the cabin for the last time. I am moving to Akron, Ohio to live with my cousin. I am 63 years old. There is nothing left for me in Appalachia. Thomas is gone. Our parents are gone. The mine has closed. My hands are not strong enough for the work anymore, and the work is not here anymore either. So the weakness of my hands and the emptiness of the county have arrived at the same conclusion from opposite directions. I am leaving everything beneath the hearthstone as I left it during the war. The jewelry belonged to Thomas's mother and grandmother. The money is what we saved before the war, plus my wages from the hospital in Richmond, plus what remained of Thomas's army pension, after I used most of it to keep the farm from being seized in 1947, which was a year I do not wish to remember in detail. I leave it all for whoever finds this cabin next. Whoever you are, you will be a stranger to me, but you will not be a stranger to this place. The cabin will know you if you deserve to stay. I hope it knows you well. Ruth Harlan. April 1953. Amara set the ledger down on the shelf with the care of someone handling a document that is not just old, but sacred, not in the religious sense, but in the human sense. The sense in which anything that carries the full weight of a person's life and loss and endurance becomes too important to treat casually. She lifted the rosary, simple dark wooden beads strung on a cord with a small brass cross. The beads were smooth from years of fingers moving across them in prayer. The wood darkened by the oils of a hand that had held them through war and widowhood, and the long diminishing years that followed. She held the rosary in her palm and closed her fingers around it, and felt the weight of someone else's faith pressing against her skin. Then she reached into the oilcloth bundle again deeper and found something she had missed. A small cloth pouch tucked into the bottom fold. Inside the pouch, folded carefully and bundled with yarn, was money. Old money. American bills from the 1940s and 1950s. Some of them silver certificates. The blue seal notes that the United States had stopped issuing in 1964, and that were now worth to collectors considerably more than their printed denomination. She counted them carefully. The face values added up to several $100s, but the collector value she estimated based on nothing more than a vague memory of a documentary she had once watched about currency collecting was significantly higher, thousands possibly. She did not sleep in the cabin that night. The roof was still too damaged to trust, and the sky through the gap in the ceiling was turning the particular shade of gray. That means rain is not a question, but an itinerary. She walked back to Welch in the gathering dusk, the oilcloth bundle in her backpack now pressed against the journal, and the notebooks, Ruth Harlan's life resting against the blank pages where Amara's life had not yet been written. The next day she took a bus to Charleston. Janet Rowe's office was on the second floor of a building on Capitol Street above a sandwich shop. Janet was 45, practical, thorough, and accustomed to the particular legal complexities of rural property. In a state where title histories could stretch back through 2 centuries of incomplete records, informal transfers, and the occasional act of God or coal company that had rearranged the landscape and the ownership simultaneously. She examined the ledger, the jewelry, the money, and the property documents. She made phone calls. She consulted statutes. She told Amara, after 2 hours of careful research, that under West Virginia law, the contents of a property belonged to the legal owner of the property. Ruth Harlan had left no will that anyone could find. She had written clearly, and in her own hand, that she intended the items to go to whoever found them. Amara asked Janet to search for living descendants of Ruth Harlan, not because the law required it, because it was right. Janet made calls over the following week. She contacted vital records offices in West Virginia and Ohio. She reached out to genealogical databases. The trail was short. Ruth Harlan had moved to Akron, Ohio in 1953. She had lived with her cousin for 11 years. The cousin died in 1964. Ruth lived alone after that in a small apartment on the east side of Akron, working as a seamstress in a garment factory until she retired in 1970. She died in 1978. She had no children. She had no surviving relatives. She was buried in a municipal cemetery in Akron in a plot that no one visited because there was no one left to visit. The jewelry and the money belonged to Amara, legally, morally, by the explicit written wish of the woman who had hidden them. Amara sold the locket and the garnet earrings to an antiques dealer in Charleston, a quiet man with knowledgeable hands who examined each piece under a loupe and offered her $9,000, which he said was fair, and which Janet Rowe, when consulted, confirmed was within the reasonable range. She sold the old currency to a numismatist in the same city, a woman with an office full of filing cabinets and magnifying glasses, who paid $4,500 for the silver certificates and the pre-war bills, handling each note with cotton gloves, as though the paper itself were alive and fragile, which in a sense it was. $13,500, enough to begin. She kept the ring with the blue stone. She kept the rosary. She kept the ledger. She placed Ruth's ring on a gold chain next to her grandmother's turquoise ring and hung them both around her neck, and the two rings rested against her sternum, one warm from her body heat and one still carrying that particular coolness of stones that have been underground, and together they made a weight that felt not like a burden, but like a compass pointing in two directions at once, backward toward the women who had left them, and forward toward whatever Amara was becoming. Word traveled fast in a county of 18,000 people, and it traveled fastest when the word involved money. Within a week, everyone in the township of Elkhorn and most of the people in Welch knew that a young woman from Boston had bought the Harlan cabin for $1, found treasure under the hearthstone, and was planning to stay. Most people reacted with curiosity and cautious welcome, but not everyone. Harlan Webb showed up at the county office on a Thursday morning, 8 days after Amara's purchase. He was 58 years old, thick-armed, thick-necked, with hands that had been shaped by 30 years in the mines before the mines closed, and left him with a pension that covered rent on a trailer at the edge of town and not much else. His face carried the particular landscape of a man who has worked underground, the deep lines around the eyes, the grayish cast to the skin that never entirely fades, even after years in the daylight, as though the mine had stained him from the inside. He told Betty Combs that he was a descendant of the Harlan family and that the cabin and everything in it belonged to him by right of blood. Betty called Janet Rowe. Janet pulled records. The name Harlan was common in Appalachia, common enough that sharing it proved nothing. Harlan Webb could not produce a single document, a family Bible entry, a birth certificate, a marriage record, anything that connected him to Ruth and Thomas Harlan. His claim had no legal foundation. Janet told him so politely, but without ambiguity. The matter was closed, but Harlan Webb was not finished. He came to the cabin. It was a Tuesday afternoon, late in the day, the light going amber and long. Amara was inside on her knees on the flagstone floor, scrubbing the stones with a soft brush and a bucket of soapy water. The work slow and meditative, each stone revealing its true color under the grime, the way a face reveals its true expression when the mask comes off. She did not hear him approach, because the path was grass and his boots were soft-soled, and the sound of the brush on stone filled the small room, the way white noise fills a space covering everything beneath it. She saw the shadow first, a shape in the window blocking the late light. She looked up. A man was standing outside the garden gate, maybe 30 feet from the cabin door. He was not moving. He was not calling out. He was just standing there, his weight on his heels, his hands at his sides, looking at the cabin and at Amara through the window, with an expression she could not read from that distance, but that she felt in her body as a tightening across her shoulders and a quickening in her pulse, the ancient mammalian response to being watched by something you do not understand. He stood for maybe 2 minutes. Then he turned and walked back down the path and disappeared around the bend in the ridge. Amara did not move from her position on the floor for a long time after he left. Her hands were still holding the brush. The soapy water in the bucket had gone cold. The shadow was gone from the window, but the impression of it remained the way the after-image of a bright light remains on your retina. After you close your eyes, a dark shape burned into the field of your vision. She wrote in her journal that night by candlelight on the floor of the cabin, because the roof was not yet fixed, and she was sleeping at the motel, but had stayed late to write. She had learned that she wrote best in this room, in the silence of the Appalachian evening, with the smell of stone and damp earth around her, and the awareness that the walls enclosing her had been built by hands that were now dust, but whose work remained steady and plumb and true. I bought this cabin legally. Ruth left it for whoever came next. But sometimes legal and welcome are two different things, and the distance between them is the exact width of a window through which a stranger watches you and says nothing. The next morning, she hired Earl Sizemore. Earl was 67 years old. He had been restoring old stone structures in the Appalachian Hollows for 35 years, ever since he came home from a construction job in Morgantown, and realized that the work he wanted to do was not building new things, but keeping old things alive. His hands were the hands of his profession, large scarred calloused across the palms and the fingertips. The skin of the knuckles cracked and darkened from decades of lime mortar and mountain weather. His back was slightly bent, not from injury, but from a lifetime of leaning over walls and examining foundations, and crouching in crawl spaces, the posture of a man who has spent more of his life looking at the ground than at the sky. His wife had died 5 years ago. Lung cancer. She had worked for 20 years in a building adjacent to a coal processing facility, breathing air that the company had assured her was within acceptable limits, which it was technically if you accepted limits that were set by people who did not have to breathe the air. Earl had nursed her through the last 8 months, which is a verb that does not begin to contain what those 8 months held. And when she died, he had continued working because work was the only language he had left for the things he felt. And stone was the only material that would hold the shape of his grief without cracking. His son, Wade, 35, quiet, built like a shorter version of his father, worked alongside him. Wade had the particular silence of a man who has grown up watching his father speak through labor and has adopted the same dialect. Earl walked through the cabin on his first visit. He ran his hands over the walls. He pressed his palms flat against the stone the way a doctor presses a stethoscope to a chest, listening for something beneath the surface. He climbed a ladder Wade had brought and examined the roof beams. He peered up the chimney from inside the firebox, his face tilted up into the darkness, reading the structure the way Amara read a poem, looking for the line that held the others in place. The walls are perfect, child. Appalachian fieldstone, harder than the heads of the politicians in Washington. His voice was deep and unhurried, with the cadence of someone who measures words the way he measures stone, by weight rather than quantity. The roof needs work, but the bones are solid. This cabin wants to live. He quoted her a price that was fair and included his agreement to teach her portions of the work. He believed that people who lived in old buildings should understand how those buildings were made, the way people who eat food should understand where it grows. Not because the knowledge was practically necessary, but because it created a relationship between the dweller and the dwelling that changed both of them. He taught her to mix lime mortar, the traditional way, slaking the quicklime in water, and letting it cure the chemical reaction, producing a heat that surprised her the first time she felt it through the mixing trough. The stone itself generating warmth as it transformed from one thing into another. He taught her to choose stones for repair work, explaining that each stone had a shape and a weight and a personality, and the skill was not in forcing stones into positions, but in finding the stone that wanted to be in each position, the way a poet finds the word that wants to be in each line. She learned. Her hands blistered. The blisters hardened into calluses. The calluses became part of her new geography on the surface of hands that had previously known only pen and paper and keyboard. And the new geography changed how the old geography felt. So that when she held her pen at the end of a day of stonework, the pen felt different in her grip, lighter, more deliberate, an instrument she was choosing rather than defaulting to. Earl did not ask personal questions. He taught by demonstration, by correction, by the occasional grunt of approval when Amara laid a stone correctly. He did not praise easily. When praise came, it came in the form of a nod or a half-syllable sound that might have been a word in a language that only masons spoke. One afternoon, while they were rebuilding the upper section of the chimney, the sky clear and blue above them, and the valley spread out below in shades of green that seemed to have been invented specifically for this place, Earl broke his silence. "Where are your parents, child?" "Boston. They know you're down here." The question hung in the mountain air. Amara held a stone in both hands, a stone she had been about to place, and she did not place it. She held it. She felt its weight. "Not here, sir." Earl did not respond. He took the stone from her hands and placed it himself, adjusting its position with small taps of his mason's hammer. Each tap precise, the sound of it echoing off the hillside like a heartbeat amplified by the valley's acoustics. The next morning when Amara arrived at the cabin at 7:30, There was a basket on the kitchen table, a cloth-covered basket containing biscuits and gravy still warm, the biscuits golden and flaky, and the gravy thick with sausage and black pepper. Earl's truck was already gone. Wade was on the roof replacing slates. Neither of them mentioned the basket. Amara stood in front of the table and looked at the basket and felt something move in her chest that she had not felt in months, something that hurt and healed simultaneously the way a joint hurts when you move it after it has been immobilized for too long. The pain not of injury but of restoration. She looked at the basket on the table and thought of the apple her father used to place on the kitchen table in Brookline every morning. The apple that said what Emeka could not say. The apple that was gone on the morning of her birthday. The morning the table was bare, and the door was locked and the curtain moved, and no one came down. The basket was not an apple. Earl was not her father. But the language was the same. Food placed silently on a surface by hands that did not know how to say what they meant, and so let the food say it instead. She turned away from the table so that Wade, if he looked through the window from the roof, would not see that her eyes were wet. The roof was completed in 3 weeks. Earl and Wade replaced the missing slates using reclaimed stone from a salvage yard in Greenbrier County, matching the color and thickness as closely as possible, because Earl believed that a repair should honor the original, the way a translation honors a poem, preserving the intent even when the exact materials are no longer available. The chimney took another week. The collapsed section was rebuilt stone by stone, each one chosen, and placed with the deliberation of a man who understood that a chimney is not just a structure, but a channel, a passage between the fire inside and the sky outside, and that a poorly built chimney is not just a construction flaw, but a broken conversation between a house and the weather. Amara did the interior work mostly herself. She scrubbed the flagstones on her hands and knees stone by stone, the brush moving in small circles, each circle revealing a slightly different shade of gray beneath the decades of ash and dust. She washed the walls until the stones seemed to glow from within, a soft luminescence that she had not expected, as though the stone had been holding light inside itself all these years and was finally being allowed to release it. She cleaned the great hearth, brushing out the ashes of fires that had been dead longer than she had been alive, the ashes fine and gray and weightless, rising in small clouds as her brush disturbed them, and settling again on her arms and her clothes and her face, so that by the end of each day she was covered in the residue of someone else's warmth. She ordered window glass from a glazier in Welch. She rebuilt the shelves above the mantel, sanding the old wood smooth and oiling it with linseed oil that smelled sweet and ancient. She bought a small iron bed frame and a mattress from an estate sale in Welch, and a wooden table and 2 chairs from another estate sale in a neighboring county, carrying them up the path with help from Wade, who did not speak during the entire 2.5-mile walk, but who carried his end of the table with a steadiness that said everything his mouth did not. She sewed curtains from a bolt of natural linen sitting cross-legged on the cabin floor, with a needle and thread, the stitches uneven, but holding each stitch a small act of domestication, a claim of permanence stitched into fabric. She placed Ruth's ledger on the mantel shelf and the rosary beside it, and the photograph from the locket propped against the wall behind them. Ruth and Thomas Harlan, young and solemn, and dressed for a photograph they could not have known would survive them by 90 years, looking out from the mantel of their own home at a woman they had never met, who was now, by the strange arithmetic of time and abandonment and $1 real estate transactions, the keeper of their memory. The first night she slept in the cabin on the iron bed with the linen curtains drawn and the door bolted and the windows shut against the mountain dark. She lay on her back and looked up at the repaired ceiling and listened to the absolute silence of a place where no electricity hummed and no traffic passed and no neighbor's television murmured through the walls. Just dark. Just the sound of her own breathing and the creak of the bed frame when she shifted, and the wind, always the wind, moving through the trees outside and pressing against the stone walls with a gentle, persistent pressure, as though the wind were testing the cabin the way a friend tests a handshake firmly, but without hostility. She was alone, completely fundamentally alone in a way she had never been in her life. In Boston, even in the hostel, there had always been the proximity of other humans, the ambient awareness of shared space. Here, there was nothing, no one within a mile. No light except the stars, which were astonishing a sky so thick with them that it looked less like a sky and more like a ceiling that had been shattered and was letting the light of some larger room shine through the cracks. She reached for the turquoise ring in the dark and held it between her thumb and forefinger and whispered into the silence of the cabin, into the stone walls and the wooden beams and the great cold hearth. I am here now, Grandma. I made it. Then the storm came. July. 3 days of rain that fell not in drops but in sheets, as though the sky had given up on the concept of individual raindrops and had decided to deliver its water in bulk. The creek below the cabin swelled from a murmur to a roar. The path became a river of mud. The world outside the cabin's 2 windows was gray and liquid and impassable. Amara was trapped. 2 days without being able to walk to the township. Her food supply was 3 cans of beans, a bag of rice, and a box of crackers. She cooked the beans on the hearth in a cast-iron pot she had bought at the estate sale, hanging it from the iron crane the way Ruth Harlan must have hung her pots 80 years ago. And the beans were not good, but they were warm, and they were food and eating them in front of a fire. While rain hammered the new slate roof above her, felt less like deprivation and more like initiation. The kind of trial that a place imposes on a newcomer to determine whether the newcomer is serious, she wrote. She wrote for hours sitting at the wooden table with a candle burning, because the gray daylight through the rain-streaked windows was not enough to see by. The rain on the slate roof made a sound she had never heard before, a deep resonant percussion. Each drop a small hammer on a stone drum, the rhythm irregular but continuous. A music that the cabin had been designed to produce the roof not just a shelter, but an instrument tuned by a century and a half of weather. On the third morning, the rain stopped. The silence that followed was enormous. The way silence always is after sustained noise, less an absence of sound than a presence of quiet, a positive force that fills the space the noise has vacated. She heard footsteps on the path, heavy, deliberate the footsteps of boots on wet ground. Her pulse spiked. The shadow at the window, the man at the gate. But it was not Harlan Webb. It was Donnie Blankenship, 55 years old, her nearest neighbor, who lived a mile down the ridge with his wife and daughter, and who had walked through the mud and the aftermath of 3 days of rain to check on the young woman who had moved into the cabin on the hill. He was carrying a burlap sack. Inside a bag of potatoes, a loaf of bread his wife had baked that morning, and a jar of blackberry preserves. He set the sack on the table inside the cabin door and looked around the room with the appraising eye of a man who has lived in these mountains his entire life and knows what a well-kept cabin looks like. If you are going to live up here alone, somebody needs to know you are here. His voice was matter-of-fact without sentimentality, the voice of a man stating a practical truth. You come down for supper on Sundays. My wife makes enough for an army, and we have never had an army show up, so there is always extra. It was not an invitation. It was an instruction. The kind of instruction that mountain people give when they have decided you belong and are not interested in debating the point. Amara carried the potatoes to the shelf and the bread to the table and the preserves to the windowsill, and each object she placed in the cabin felt like a small anchor, a point of attachment between her life and this place, and the cabin which had been empty for 70 years and full of ghosts. For longer than that began to feel less like a shelter and more like something she was not ready to name. Late August. The cabin was finished. The roof was whole. The chimney drew clean. The windows held glass. The curtains hung straight. The floor was scrubbed. The fire laid but not lit, the hearth clean. The hearthstone back in its position over the sealed chamber, holding its secret again. Though the secret was different now. Lighter, emptied of jewelry and money, but still holding the memory of what had been there. Amara knelt at the hearth one more time. she built a fire. Newspaper and kindling, and split hickory from the pile Donnie had sold her, at a price she suspected was well below market, because Donnie Blankenship was the kind of man who adjusted his prices based on who was buying, and did not consider this charity, but common sense. The fire caught. The flame climbed from paper to kindling to wood. The hickory began to burn slowly the way hardwood burns, reluctant at first, and then committed the smoke sweet and fragrant rising into the chimney that Earl and Amara had rebuilt together, stone by stone, and the draught pulled the smoke upward and out, and the heat spread into the room, into the flagstones, into the walls, into the beams, into every surface that had been cold for 70 years, and the cabin filled with warmth and light and the smell of burning wood. And Amara sat at the wooden table with a cup of tea and her leather journal open before her, and the fire casting moving shadows across the page and across her hands, and across the turquoise ring and the bluestone ring hanging from the chain at her throat. And she understood for the first time in her life what the word home meant. Not the house in Brookline, not the place where she had performed the role of good daughter in exchange for conditional love and a red apple on the table. Home was this, a place where no one required her to be anything other than what she was, a place that asked nothing of her except presence and care, a place where she could write. She picked up her pen, she opened to a blank page, and she began. She wrote the way the hickory burned, slowly at first, reluctant, unsure of its own heat, then committed. Every morning she sat at the wooden table before the sun cleared the eastern ridge, when the light in the cabin was grey and tentative, and the fire from the night before had collapsed into embers that glowed orange in the dark mouth of the hearth. Like the last syllable of a sentence the fire had been trying to finish all night. She made tea on the iron crane, boiling water in a kettle that Earl had found in a barn sale, and delivered without comment. And she sat with the cup between her palms and the leather journal open, and the pen in her hand, and she wrote. She wrote about her grandmother, not the grief of losing her, which she had written about before in the school literary magazine, and the prize-winning poem, and the notebooks she had filled in Brookline. She wrote now about the living version of Neka, the woman who laughed from her belly, and read clouds, and believed that a ring could know things that a person could not. She wrote about the texture of Neka's hands, which were rough on the palms and soft on the backs, and about the way Neka hummed while cooking, not a melody but a vibration, a sound that seemed to come from the same place inside her body, that the laughter came from somewhere below the ribs, where joy and sorrow share a room and take turns sleeping. She wrote about her parents. This was harder. The anger was still there, compacted and dense like a stone at the bottom of a well. But something had begun to shift around it. Distance does this. Distance does not erase the thing that hurt you, but it gives you room to walk around it, to see it from angles that were not available when you were pressed up against it. From 600 miles away, inside a stone cabin that smelled like wood smoke and linseed oil, Amara could begin to see her parents not just as the people who had locked the door and packed the suitcase, but as the people who had slept on floors and worked night shifts and placed apples on tables. The people whose love was real and whose fear was real, and whose inability to distinguish between the two had caused the only kind of damage that love is capable of causing, which is the kind that leaves no mark on the skin, but redesigns the architecture of the heart. She did not forgive them. Forgiveness was too large a word for what she was doing, too final, too clean. What she was doing was closer to archaeology. She was carefully excavating the layers of her own history, brushing away the ash and the anger, the way she had brushed ash from the hearthstone, trying to see the shape of what was underneath. And what was underneath was not forgiveness and was not resentment, but was something more complicated, something that lived in the space between those two things. The way a river lives in the space between its banks, shaped by both sides, but belonging to neither. She wrote about Ruth Harlan, This was the easiest and the strangest of the three because Ruth was a woman she had never met and would never meet, and yet whose presence she felt in the cabin every day, in the blackened stones of the hearth, in the iron crane, in the way the door hung on its hinges, in the rosary on the mantel shelf, and the photograph of two young people dressed for eternity. Ruth had become in Amara's imagination, and increasingly in her poetry, a second grandmother. A woman separated from Neka by culture and continent and generation, but connected to her by the particular understanding that certain women share across all boundaries. The understanding that loss does not end a life but rearranges it, and that what you leave behind for strangers is sometimes the most intimate thing you will ever give. 6 months after she lit the first fire, Amara mailed a manila envelope to a small literary magazine based in Charleston. Inside were 3 poems. The first was about the hearthstone. The second was about the view from the cabin door at dawn when the fog fills the valley below the ridge and the treetops poke through the white surface like islands in a pale ocean, and the world looks new and provisional as though it has not yet decided what shape to take today. The third was about two rings on a chain. The acceptance letter arrived 3 weeks later, forwarded by Betty Combs through the post office in Welch, because Amara did not have a mailbox at the cabin, and all her mail came through Betty, who had appointed herself the unofficial postmistress and social coordinator of Amara's life in McDowell County. The letter was typed on cream-colored paper, with the magazine's name at the top in small serif type, and it said in language that was professional, but contained a warmth that Amara could feel through the formality that the editors had selected all 3 poems for publication in the spring issue. Amara sat on the stone bench outside the cabin door. The bench that Earl and Wade had built for her as a gift when the chimney was finished, laid from the same fieldstone as the cabin walls, fitted without mortar, held together by gravity and geometry, the way Earl believed all good things should be held together. She held the acceptance letter in both hands and read it twice and then a third time, and then she pressed it against her chest and closed her eyes and cried. She had not cried since the morning she left Brookline. She had come close, standing in front of Earl's basket on the kitchen table, but she had turned away before the tears could fall, because Wade was on the roof, and she did not want to be seen crying by a man she barely knew. Now on the stone bench with the valley below her and the ridge above her, and no one within a mile, she let herself cry, and the crying was not the crying of sadness, but the crying of arrival. The sound a person makes when they have been traveling for a long time and have finally reached the place they did not know they were heading toward. She was a published poet. 3 poems in a magazine that people read, that libraries carried, that other writers submitted to and hoped to appear in. Her name, Amara Nosu, printed in type on paper, visible to anyone who picked up the issue and turned to the poetry section and read words that she had written in a stone cabin in the mountains of West Virginia, by candlelight and firelight, and the particular quality of Appalachian morning that turns everything it touches into gold. 3 months after that, she published in a second magazine, this one based in Virginia, then a third in North Carolina. The poems accumulated. They began to attract attention. The quiet kind of attention that poetry attracts, not the loud, crowded attention of fiction or film, but the intense, focused attention of readers who come to poetry the way they come to prayer, not for entertainment, but for recognition, for the shock of seeing their own unnamed feelings given a name and a shape by someone else's language. A small press in Charlottesville, Virginia, wrote to her. They were interested in seeing a collection, a full manuscript, a book of poems about Appalachia, about the cabin, about the woman who had left a life beneath a hearthstone, and the woman who had found it. Amara read the letter, sitting at the wooden table, the fire low beside her, the 2 rings clinking softly against each other at her throat. And she understood that the life her parents had said was impossible was beginning against every reasonable expectation to happen. Donnie Blankenship's Sunday suppers became the fixed point of her week. His wife, a woman named Gracie, who had the energy of someone half her age and the cooking skills of someone who had been feeding coal miners and their families for 30 years, taught Amara to make cornbread in a cast-iron skillet. The batter thin and poured sizzling into bacon grease, the resulting bread crisp on the outside and dense and slightly sweet on the inside. Nothing like the dry, crumbly cornbread Amara had encountered in Boston restaurants, which Gracie described with the diplomatic restraint of a woman who did not believe in insulting other people's food, but also did not believe in lying as not real cornbread. Their daughter, a 10-year-old named Lily with braids and a gap-toothed grin, began calling Amara sister. Amara, which is what children in Appalachia call the young women they have adopted as honorary siblings. A title that is not given lightly and that carries once given. An obligation of permanence that both parties understand without discussing. Betty Combs continued her monthly visits, arriving with a casserole in a glass dish, and the latest news from the county, which she delivered with the comprehensive authority of a woman who had been processing the paperwork of McDowell County for a quarter-century, and therefore knew not just what was happening, but why it was happening and what it would mean 6 months from now. Betty had become Amara's advocate in the wider community, defending her presence to anyone who questioned it with a directness that was characteristic of Appalachian women, of her generation women, who had watched their county lose half its population and its entire economic base, and were not inclined to turn away anyone who showed up willing to stay. That girl bought the cabin legal, she told anyone who brought up the subject. She lives there. She works on it every day. She's more committed to this county than half the people who were born here and left. Opal Lusk came on Saturdays. She was 87 years old, thin as a fence post with white hair she wore in a bun and hands that shook slightly when she held her teacup, but was steady when she gestured, which she did often, her hands drawing the shapes of her stories in the air, as though the stories were architectural and needed blueprints. She lived alone in a frame house a mile down the ridge, a house her husband had built in 1961 and that she had maintained since his death in 1999, with a combination of stubbornness, basic carpentry skills, and the occasional assistance of Earl Sizemore, who replaced her porch boards every few years and never charged her for labor. Opal had been a child during the war. She remembered things. She remembered blackout curtains and ration books and the sound of the train that carried the county's young men to the induction center in Charleston. And she remembered Ruth Harlan, a tall woman, quiet like you. Opal held her teacup in both hands and looked at the fire. The way old people look at fires, not at the flames, but through them into the place behind the flames where memory keeps its archive. She loved that husband of hers the way you love breathing. Not because you choose to, but because stopping is not an option your body will consider. She planted those roses along the south wall, the same ones that went wild after she left the same thorny mess you have been cutting back. She planted them the spring before the war, the spring Thomas enlisted. She told me once she planted them because roses outlast people, and she wanted something alive on that wall after she was gone. Opal paused. Her hand stopped moving. The teacup trembled. When Thomas died in Germany, something in her went quiet. She still walked to the post office. She still tended the garden. She still nodded when you passed her on the road. But the frequency changed. She was still broadcasting, but on a different channel, one that most people could not pick up. She lived like someone holding a long breath, waiting for permission to exhale that never came. Amara listened. She did not write while Opal talked, because writing while someone is telling you the story of a dead woman felt like taking notes during a eulogy, disrespectful to the gravity of the telling. She wrote afterward when Opal had finished her tea and walked back down the ridge with the careful, deliberate steps of a woman who understood that the ground was not as reliable as it used to be. She wrote Opal's words and her own responses to them, and the poems that grew from the intersection, the place where Opal's memories and Amara's imagination met, and produced something that belonged to neither of them, and to both of them, the way a child belongs to both parents and to neither. Harlan Webb came back on an afternoon in October, when the trees on the ridge had turned, and the valley was a burning canvas of red and gold, and the air had the crisp electric quality of Appalachian autumn, the quality that makes you breathe deeper than usual. because the air itself seems to contain more oxygen, more clarity, more of whatever element it is that makes consciousness feel like a privilege rather than a default. He knocked this time. Amara opened the door and felt her pulse jump, and then settle because the man standing on her path was not the same man who had stood silently at the gate in August. Something had shifted. His cap was in his hands instead of on his head. His eyes were aimed at the ground in front of her boots rather than at her face. The angle of his shoulders had changed from square to rounded, the posture of a man carrying something he wanted to set down. "I came to apologize." His voice was rough, not from anger, but from the effort of producing words that did not come naturally to him. Words shaped by an emotion he was not practiced in expressing. "I had no right to that cabin, and I know it. I knew it when I filed the claim. I just could not stand it. Could not stand that the mines closed and the county emptied out, and I am 58 years old, living in a trailer with a pension that covers rent and electricity and not much else. And then you show up, 18 years old, from Boston, and you find treasure in a house I walked past 1,000 times, and never once had the curiosity to open the door and look inside." He stopped. He worked his cap in his hands, the fabric twisting between his fingers. "I was angry at myself, not at you. Angry that I have lived in this county my whole life and never paid enough attention to what was right in front of me. That is not your fault. That is mine." The silence between them lasted long enough for a crow to call twice from the oak tree at the edge of the garden. Amara stepped back from the doorway. "Would you like to come in for tea?" Harlan Webb sat at the wooden table in Ruth Harlan's cabin and drank tea from a tin cup that Amara had bought at an estate sale, and that might, for all either of them knew, have been in this cabin once before, might have sat on this very table when the table was Ruth's, and the cabin was warm with fires lit by a woman who had not yet lost everything. He wrapped his thick miner's hands around the cup and looked at the fire and began to talk. He talked about McDowell County the way Opal talked about Ruth, which is to say he talked about the dead. But where Opal talked about the death of a person, Harlan talked about the death of a place. He talked about the county in the 1970s when the mines were still running, and the population was twice what it was now, and the town of Welch had a movie theater and a department store and 3 restaurants and a high school football team that went to the state championship in 1978 and lost by a field goal in overtime, a loss that the county had never entirely recovered from, because it was the last time the county had been close to winning anything. He talked about the day the last mine in his section closed, a Tuesday in November 1994. The date precise in his memory, the way certain dates are the dates that divide a life into before and after. He had driven home in his truck with his empty lunch pail on the seat beside him and his hard hat on the floor, and the knowledge that the skill he had spent 30 years acquiring was now as useful as the ability to shoe a horse. A skill that had once been essential and was now decorative, preserved only in county fairs and museum demonstrations. He talked until the tea was cold and the fire needed another log, and the light through the windows had shifted from afternoon to early evening. When he stood to leave, he placed the tin cup carefully on the table, the way you place something down when you are aware that the surface you are placing it on has history and deserves respect. "You keep this cabin right, child." His voice had changed over the course of the hour. The roughness was still there, but the edges had been sanded by the act of speaking, by the release of things he had been carrying. "It deserves to have someone in it." After he left, Amara sat at the table and opened her journal and wrote about a man who walked past a door 1,000 times and never opened it, and about a girl who opened it on her first try, and about what that difference meant, and whether it was luck or destiny, or simply the particular kind of attention that desperation produces. The way a starving person notices food that a fed person walks past without seeing. The poem she wrote that evening was the best thing she had written since arriving in McDowell County. And she knew it the way you know when you have hit the exact center of a bell by the quality of the ringing. November came and the mountains turned gray, and the wind off the ridges carried the first intimation of what Appalachian winter would mean for a woman living alone in a stone cabin with no electricity and a wood stove for heat. The temperature dropped. The path to the township hardened with frost. The mornings were bitter and dark, and the firelight in the cabin took on a deeper significance, no longer aesthetic but existential. The difference between warmth and its absence, becoming the difference between endurance and something worse. She found the first postcard in the post office box that Betty maintained for her. It was addressed to a Amara Nwosu General Delivery Welch WV in handwriting. She recognized instantly the small, precise, slightly forward-leaning script of a woman who had spent decades writing medication dosages and patient notes and grocery lists. The handwriting of efficiency of a hand that did not waste motion. The postcard had a photograph of the Boston skyline on the front. On the back, 5 words: "Winter is cold." Stay warm, no signature, no return address. No explanation of how her mother knew where she was, though Amara suspected Betty, who had a telephone, and the instincts of a woman who understood that mothers, even mothers who lock doors, remain mothers. She held the postcard for a long time. She did not cry. She did not smile. She felt the weight of 5 words written by a hand that had packed her suitcase and had also ironed her uniforms and had also covered its own mouth in a bathroom to muffle the sound of its own weeping. And the weight was not the weight of reconciliation, and was not the weight of rejection, but was the weight of a door left ajar, not open and not closed. A gap wide enough for 5 words and a photograph of a skyline, and nothing more. She put the postcard in her journal between the page where she had written about the apple and the page where she had written about the basket. February. Deeper cold. Snow on the ridge. The path to the township sometimes impassable for days. She had learned by now to stock provisions to keep the woodpile high, to anticipate the weather, by reading the clouds the way Neka had taught her. The fish-spine clouds that meant rain, and the towering flat-bottomed clouds that meant storms, and the thin, high ice crystal clouds that meant cold was coming and would stay. The second postcard arrived on a Tuesday. Same handwriting, same absent signature. Your father caught a cold last week. He is better now. The tulips in the garden are about to bloom. Amara read it by the fire snow falling outside the windows. The flakes large and slow. The kind of snow that falls when the air is very cold and very still. Each flake taking its time, descending through the gray light, like a small white decision being made by the sky. She read the postcard, and she thought about tulips blooming in a garden in Brookline, 600 miles away, tulips. Her mother had planted her mother, who expressed love through maintenance, through the tending of things, through the relentless upkeep of a life that she believed would fall apart if she stopped working on it for even a day. She did not reply, she was not ready, but she did not throw the postcard away. She put it in the journal next to the first one, and the 2 postcards sat there like bookmarks in a story that was not yet finished, marking a page she might return to later. She wrote a poem about tulips that night, about flowers that bloom in one place while someone who planted them lives in another, about the distance between a garden and a mountain, and whether that distance can be measured in miles or only in years. About the things people grow when they cannot say what they feel, the flowers and the apples and the biscuits and the postcards, all the silent, growing edible vegetable substitutes for the 3 words that some people cannot produce with their mouths. No matter how fiercely those words exist in their chests. A year passed, September again, the anniversary of her arrival. The cabin had changed and had not changed. The stones were the same stones. The hearth was the same hearth. The hearthstone sat in its position over the empty chamber, the chamber that had held its secret for 70 years, and had given it up in a single afternoon, and now held only the memory of what had been there, which is its own kind of weight and its own kind of treasure. But the cabin was clean now, and warm and lit by firelight in the evenings, and it smelled like wood smoke and linseed oil, and the particular fragrance of a space that is being lived in, the accumulated scent of cooking and sleeping and writing and breathing, the smell of habitation, of presence, of someone being here. Amara sat on the stone bench that Earl and Wade had built. The bench faced west toward the valley, toward the ridge on the far side, toward the place where the sun went down every evening in a performance that never repeated itself exactly each sunset, a variation on a theme so old that the mountains themselves had grown tired of watching and had turned their faces to stone. Tonight the sky went from gold to rose to violet. The wind came up from the valley carrying the smell of oak leaves and something sweet and decomposing. The smell of autumn in the mountains. The smell of the world putting itself to bed for winter. The trees on the ridge across the valley were turning, the maples going red, and the oaks going brown, and the occasional birch holding out in a pale, stubborn yellow that looked defiant against the darker colors around it. The fire in the cabin behind her cast amber light through the window onto the stone path. The door was open. The hearth was lit. The two rings hung on their chain against her sternum, one turquoise, one blue, both warm from her body, both carrying the weight of women who had worn them and loved in them and lost in them and left them behind for reasons that were different in detail but identical in essence. Because some things must be passed on, because holding them forever is not possible. Because the hand that loves a thing must eventually open and let the thing travel to the hand that needs it next. Her journal was open on her lap, half a poem, the pen in her right hand, the turquoise ring on her right index finger catching the last edge of daylight, the way it always caught the light, that quiet, persistent gleam that had followed her from a porch in Brookline to a ridge in Appalachia. She thought about Neka, who had known something about this ring that Amara was only now beginning to understand. Rings know things. It was not a metaphor. Or it was a metaphor, but the truest kind, the kind where the metaphor and the reality are the same thing. The ring had known. It had traveled from a wedding in 1962 to a girl's hand in 2019, to a porch in Brookline, to a cabin in Appalachia. At every stage it had pointed toward the next stage, not through magic, but through the particular gravity that certain objects acquire when they are loved enough. A gravity that bends the trajectory of the person who carries them the way a planet bends the path of light. She thought about Ruth Harlan, who had written a sentence in 1939 that Amara now carried inside her, the way Ruth had carried the rosary as a tool for navigating darkness. The hearth holds what the heart cannot carry. Ruth had written those words in a ledger, and hidden the ledger beneath a stone, and left the stone and the ledger and the sentence for whoever came next, not knowing who that would be, not caring. Trusting the cabin to hold her gifts, the way she had trusted Thomas to come home from the war, with a faith that was not rational, but was necessary. The kind of faith that is not the absence of doubt, but the decision to act despite it. She thought about her parents, Emeka and Chidinma Nwosu of Brookline, Massachusetts, who had crossed an ocean and slept on floors and worked nights and placed apples on tables and packed suitcases and locked doors and pulled curtains aside to watch their daughter leave and then let the curtain fall. She had not spoken to them in over a year. She did not miss them the way she had expected to miss them, with a constant ache, a phantom limb sensation of something amputated. She missed an idea of them, a version that had never existed, the version that could look at a poem and see not a threat to their investment, but an expression of the same tenacity they had used to build a life from nothing. The same stubbornness, the same refusal to accept that the world's definition of value was the only definition available. But the postcards, the unsigned, unaddressed 5-word dispatches from a woman who could not say "I'm sorry" or "I was wrong" or "I miss you," but could say "stay warm and the tulips are blooming," which in the language of Chidinma Nwosu meant the same thing, or close enough. Close enough that Amara could feel the heat of it through 600 miles of mountain and highway and silence. The door was not closed. It was ajar, a gap wide enough for a postcard, maybe eventually wide enough for a voice, maybe eventually wide enough for a body to walk through. She thought about Earl Sizemore, who had placed a basket on a table and said nothing, the way Emeka had placed an apple on a table and said nothing. Both men fluent in the same silent language, the language of food set down by hands that cannot speak. And she thought about how strange it was that she had traveled 600 miles to find a man who expressed love exactly the way her father did. and how the recognition of that similarity was both a wound and a salve hurting, because it reminded her of what she had lost, and healing because it showed her that what she had lost was not unique to one man, but was a dialect spoken by many men. Quiet men, working men, men who build things and repair things and place things on tables and walk away before anyone can thank them. She thought about Donnie, who had walked through mud to bring potatoes and an instruction to come to supper. About Betty, who had paid $1 from her own purse and stamped a form and said welcome. About Opal, who had carried the memory of a dead woman for 80 years and shared it over tea with a living one. About Harlan Webb, who had walked past a door 1,000 times and never opened it, and then come back to apologize for the anger he felt about his own blindness. Family is not blood. Family is recognition. The moment when someone sees that you need what they have and decides not to walk past. She understood this now, sitting on the stone bench with the fire behind her, and the sunset before her, and the 2 rings at her throat, and the half-finished poem on her lap. She understood that Ruth Harlan had understood it in 1939, writing in her ledger by lamplight, while her husband packed his army kit. Understood that Neka had understood it on a porch in Brookline, sliding a gold ring onto a 12-year-old's finger and telling her that rings know things. These women had been speaking to each other across decades and distances in a conversation Amara had walked into without knowing it was happening. And the cabin was the room where the conversation took place, and the hearthstone was the table where they set their offerings, and the fire was the warmth that kept the conversation going through the dark and the cold, and the 70 years of silence. Some feelings are too heavy for a single life. They have to be set down. A hearthstone is a good place, a warm place, a place where people gather and stories are told, and the dead are remembered, and the living are fed. And what is set down there does not vanish. It waits. It holds its shape. It keeps its warmth. It waits for the next pair of hands strong enough to lift it. Amara put the pen down. She closed the journal. She looked at the fire through the open door of the cabin, the flames low now, moving slowly. The hickory reduced to coals that pulsed with a deep red-orange glow, the color of something that has burned past urgency and settled into endurance. She looked at the valley. The last light was gone. The mountains were black shapes against a sky that was not yet dark enough for stars, but was no longer bright enough to call day. The in-between time, the threshold. On the mantel shelf inside the cabin, Ruth's ledger sat beside the rosary and the photograph of 2 young people who had looked into a camera in the 1930s and had not known that their image would end up on a shelf in their own home. 90 years later, watched over by a woman they had never dreamed of, a woman from a place they had never been, who had come to their cabin with nothing and found everything they had left behind and turned it into a life they could not have imagined but might, if they could see it, have recognized. And on the kitchen table, in the spot where no apple had ever been placed, but where a cloth-covered basket now sat there, were biscuits that Earl Sizemore had brought that morning, baked by his own hands from his dead wife's recipe, left on the table without a word. The same way he always left them. The same way Emeka Nusu had left an apple on a different table, in a different state, in a different life. The food placed where the words could not go, the offering made in the only language that both men spoke, the language of hands that work, and mouths that cannot find the shape of the thing they need to say. And so let the bread speak, let the apple speak, let the warm thing on the table stand for the warm thing in the chest, let the gift left in silence be the only eloquence required. Amara Nwosu was 18 years old. She had $1, and she spent it on a crumbling stone cabin in the mountains of Appalachia, in a county that the world had forgotten, in a hollow that the maps barely showed, in a place where the wind smelled like oak, and the light came through fog like memory through sleep. It was the best dollar she ever spent. She looked at the fire. She looked at the 2 rings. She looked at the postcard from her mother tucked inside the journal, and the basket on the table, and the photograph on the mantel, and the stone walls that had held their shape for 150 years and would hold them for 150 more. Somewhere in the embers, or in the space behind the embers, or in the place where fire remembers what it has burned, and imagination invents what it has not. She saw two women sitting together. One wore a ring with a turquoise stone. The other wore a ring with a blue stone. They were not looking at her. They were looking at each other. And they were laughing. Not the polite laughter of strangers meeting, but the deep, unguarded, belly-deep laughter of women who have recognized each other across time and found the recognition funny and wonderful and exactly right. The wind moved through the valley. The coals pulsed. The cabin held. And on the table where no apple had ever been placed, but where a basket now sat, the biscuits were still warm.